Thank you very much, Hannah. Thanks to all of you coming. Just hearing there about the agenda coming up, it does sound as if that's perfectly timed, because I think election nights tend to be when Russia does indeed come in from the cold. So that's obviously very, very good planning there. We have a subject before us, though, which is could not be more pertinent for our time. You'll have known that the Oxford English Dictionary's word of the year for 2016 was post-truth. You'll also know that there are 3 books, no less than 3, no fewer than 3 rather, that have come out right now on that subject, and central to any argument about this post-truth landscape is fake news, and that is the subject before us. And it's going to be discussed by 6 people, all expertly placed, either practitioners in the news business or people who are monitoring and closely looking at how we get our information and what might be done about it. It's not a formal debate with a motion to be discussed. Instead, it is a discussion where we're going to hear these conflicting and competing arguments over here, and then in our final segment, we're going to open it out to all of you for thoughts and contributions. So before we get to introducing our very stellar panel, I thought I would do a little fake news survey, if you like, with all of you. I'm going to ask for a show of hands when I give you, first of all, 3 stories, all of which in 2016 went viral, but only one of which is actually true. And I'm going to ask you to raise your hands when you hear the true one. That's the deal now. So I'm going to read you, I'm not going to read you, I'm just going to tell you 3 things that went viral over the last, in 2016, and you have to raise your hand when you think which of these stories is true. So the first one is that the Pope, during the 2016 election campaign, endorsed Donald Trump. Any takers for that one? None for that. The second story that went viral, a clip that went around the internet, featured Donald Trump saying he would date his daughter Ivanka if only he wasn't married.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. No? No, very good. And the third one says that Hillary Clinton ran a child sex ring from the basement of a pizza restaurant in Washington, D.C. Very, very good. So that tells me what kind of audience, and indeed what kind of panel, we have. So that gets us going. Let me then, without further ado, introduce to you our panel, who we're going to hear from very quickly. First up, and on the physical far right of this panel, is a professor at Columbia Law School and a former advisor in the Obama White House. His most recent book, which I can tell you is on sale after this event outside this venue, is The Attention Merchants, How Our Time and Attention Are Gathered and Sold. In 2013, he was named one of America's 100 most influential lawyers. He is Tim Wu. Next to him is one of this country's most successful comedy writers. He co-created the legendary Alan Partridge and wrote the political comedy series The Thick of It, the film In the Loop, and was the showrunner on the White House hit comedy Veep. He is Armando Iannucci. You already gave her a warm welcome when she arrived. She is currently the editor of BBC Radio 4's Today programme and revels in the title of George Osborne's predecessor as the former editor of the Evening Standard, Sarah Sands. On my left, as I've often felt, is a journalist and author with a regular column in The Spectator, a contributor to Breitbart News, and his books include How to Be Right, The Essential Guide to Making Lefty Liberals History. A warm welcome for James Dellingpole. And completing our, completing our physical panel, because there's somebody else joining us by video link, is somebody whose services I suppose every single person in this room uses every single day. He is, of course, the founder of Wikipedia, the online not-for-profit encyclopedia, who has now set himself a new task in order to fight fake news. He's recently launched Wiki Tribune, a news website which will bring together professional journalists and volunteers working together to create fact-checked and reliable news. He is Jimmy Wales. And completing our panel live from, via video link, he is the media editor of BuzzFeed News, where he leads BuzzFeed's analysis of fake news, training journalists all over the world in verification and debunking of news, depending on whether it's true or false. The author of Regret the Error, How Media Mistakes Pollute the Press and Imperil Free Speech. I'm hoping we have a video link to Craig Silverman. There he is. Good. So what we're going to do is hear an opening sort of case, or just an opening answer really from me, brief and to the point from each of our speakers. And Tim Wu, I'm going to go to you first because I think with any question like this, it helps to begin with a definition. So define for us what we're talking about. Tim Wu, what is fake news?
Sure, that's a great question. I've spent quite a bit of time looking into the history of the news, in particular fake news. And I think there's two main categories of fake news that you see emerging in the history, depending on their motivation. The first is commercially fake news. This usually arises when you have a business model that, as most media do, that depends on gathering up human attention, where you change the facts to make a story more commercially appealing, to get in more readers. So the first example I was able to find of this was the New York Sun in the 1830s reported in a 6-part series what it had found on the moon. Among the things it found were tall yew trees, like those in England, giant lakes, and most important, man bats, which were these creatures like us, but capable of flight and fond of fornication. So that was an example. The motive of this was pretty clearly to drive circulation of the newspaper, and this was the first newspaper, New York Sun, that was completely dependent on advertising. And so you can see this sort of commercially motivated fake news. You just make up better facts because they're more interesting. The second kind of fake news is different and used to be called, and has its origins in, atrocity propaganda. So, I think the pioneer of this was, frankly, this country and its newspapers and some of its propaganda ministries in the First World War. And this is where you make stories, fake stories, for political or strategic reasons. So during the First World War, there was enormous stories of the atrocities committed by the Germans against the Belgians. It was a big thing, constant publication. Many of these stories were never, the Germans impaled children on bayonets and sang songs about it. Many of these stories clearly made up or never verified and used for obvious political reasons. So those are the two motivations. And I think today what's happened is they come together. So many of our outlets, Facebook and Google, who aren't here as examples, depend so heavily on traffic, clicks, time on site, attention, frankly, that they have a commercial motivation to want to have fake news. And then there's a lot of people still, and have always been, that have a political reason to want to have fake news, for more than one reason. But essentially, I think that atrocity element is there as well. So it's come together, and that's our modern-day fake news.
Very good. Thank you. We're definitely going to get you to expand on that. Craig Silverman, I hope you can hear us well. This is an area that you study closely. Are you able to give us how you can tell the difference between a story that might have a couple of inaccuracies in it and something that you would slap the label on of fake news? And then perhaps while you're doing that, just explain to us on what sort of scale of threat you think this poses to democracy and to our way of life, really.
Yes, hello everyone. So I do think, similar to what Tim said, putting that label of fake on something, for me, it has to be completely fabricated. As you noted, there are often, frequently, news reports that have some type of factual error in them. And that's a very common thing. I spent about a decade looking at mistakes in the media, and journalists, we do make a lot of mistakes, there's no question about that. But there is a difference, as Tim said, of something that is deliberately created to deceive people. And I do think the commercial piece is an important thing to note in the media environment we're seeing right now. In terms of the impact on it, One of the things that I think it does on a really basic level is it increases the amount of confusion that we have in the information space. When you have stuff that is true or mostly true, and then you have things that are completely false, and they're sometimes built around the same storylines or events, that creates a lot of confusion for people. I think it also has a role in potentially further politically polarizing people. Someone who is already a bit to the left or a bit to the right, they start to consume things that are along those lines and a little more extreme, and over time, they can potentially become more polarized because it's feeding them further those views. I do think one of the things that in the wake of the US election was maybe taken too far is the idea that Trump was elected because of fake news. I don't think that's the case. I do think it may have pushed some people who are already polarized maybe a little bit further, and it's certainly created a lot of confusion in the information space. But I don't know that it's necessarily going to change someone's mind unless there is a huge amount of exposure on a constant basis.
Thank you. That's helpful. Armando, to you, you have made your name writing satirical fiction, often political fiction. Is it harder, looking at just the events of the last year, to separate fiction from fact? And almost because fact is almost outstripping anything you could have made up.
Yes, that's one of the reasons I'm grateful that I gave up doing Veep, because I no longer find the situation in America funny. I find it depressing. Yes, there are stories happening now that we would have considered when we were writing these shows, and then I would have rejected them as being too silly. For example, I think it was a UKIP, I might have got this wrong, or it was certainly a candidate in the election yesterday was advocating reintroducing capital punishment for suicide bombers, which, do you know what I mean? Is a sort of, and I was looking at, but I find Trump and his take on this, I was watching him, and it's the brazen way in which he takes fact and fiction and mixes the two that intrigues me. He talked about recently how this, what did you do in your first 100 days was a nonsense, and it was a terrible false target, it was artificial, he wasn't interested. And he said this at a speech at a rally given to mark his first 100 days. And as I was watching him, I was thinking, this is the problem, because when you're writing comedy, you're writing distortions and exaggerations. You take something that's true, and you bend it and twist it until it becomes ridiculous. But that's what he does in every sentence he speaks. So he is his own sort of self-basting satirist, really.
Yes.
And therefore, what do we do? And it's interesting that the comedians who have had any kind of impact are the ones who have actually taken the opposite view and gone, okay, well, let's look at facts, let's examine facts, let's hire a team of journalists and researchers, let's look at the archives. I'm talking people like John Oliver and Bill Maher.
So almost shrinking it back to the actual core of the truth rather than all the twisting.
Yes, well, you've got to be careful what you mean by the truth.
Yeah.
I mean, truth has now become so subjective, but I think what they're doing is saying, okay, let's examine the facts. And one thing that John Oliver did throw up was a clip of Newt Gingrich in the last election being asked, saying people are worried because crime is going up. And the reporter's saying, no, crime is going down. No, he's saying, crime has gone up. And she said, no, the figures show, the facts show that crime is going down. And he said, I know, but people feel crime is going up. And that's what matters.
Yeah. I mean, there's a risk of this becoming a philosophy seminar, but I just want to know the difference in your mind, because you made a distinction just there between facts, you said, is different from truth.
Oh, right, okay.
So just tell us how you were using
only
the term.
in that truth, we like to think that truth is absolute, but it's not. Any scientist will tell you that a theory that becomes accepted is accepted because it's the most recently and most, so far, foolproof theory that explains what's happening, but it may well be superseded by an even more complex and enlightening theory. I'm not saying that. I just wonder whether we're on the verge of finding out that, truth, rather like the atom, is slightly indefinable until somebody interprets it. And as soon as you interpret it, it interprets a fact. It's the interpretation you put on a fact that we consider what is true and what's not true.
We may want to pick up with that more. So to you, Sarah Sands, you've worked for what Donald Trump would revile as the mainstream media, the sort of hated mainstream media in print and in broadcast now, both. What change have you noticed, or challenge almost, has fake news posed to you, perhaps even directly? Have there been stories that are running that you think are fake, and yet they're going viral, and you're thinking, how do we cover this? What should we do? So, what impact is fake news having on the news landscape that you occupy a pretty central position in?
Actually, I think it's a big opportunity. There was a conversation I overheard yesterday of someone saying, where do you get what's your news source? Which is a question people ask now. And the guy said, oh, I go to Google News and then I go to a trusted source. And I think that is, that's a sort of interesting distinction. And for, at the BBC, you're at quite the sort of holy orders side of all this. So, the BBC's entire reputation stands on it being a trusted source. So it's just not worth the risk, apart from anything else. So, even talking about Manchester, for instance, where there's a great, obviously, outpouring of information and a lot of it wrong. But the idea that you don't have to be first, you have to be right, is very helpful, actually.
That's interesting. So were you sort of double-checking and triple-checking some of those reports that were coming
Yes.
in on Manchester in a way that was almost, was it even more vigilant than it might have been done 2 or 3 years ago?
More vigilant than I've ever seen,
Right.
yeah.
And
So
that's
that
part
degree of vigilance is to say, because the entire reputation of the BBC stands on it being trusted, and
But particularly now in the
trusted.
era of fake news.
Particularly now.
Very
So that's that's really the virtue now. So, and I think that that's true in slightly different degrees elsewhere. That actually mainstream media, apart from anything else, newspapers, having thought they were on their sort of deathbed for a while, there's a glimmer of hope now, because the advertising may come back is one thing.
So you're hearing from 3 different people there, or 4 actually, James Delingpole, that fake news one way and another is an issue, it's a problem. How serious a problem is it, do you think?
I'm sorry to say this to everyone here, but you're wasting your evening. Fake news is fake news. Tim quite rightly said that fake news has been with us in one form or another for centuries. People have always been making stuff up for propaganda purposes or to blacken the reputation of their enemies. And there's a line that goes from the blood libel told against the Jews, the idea that the Jews were going about murdering Christian children and drinking their blood, right the way to the protocols of the elders of Zion, for example, this fabrication many centuries later. You can look at things like the recent-ish 4chan scam, where they got revenge on their feminist enemies by persuading them that there was this thing happening, that women were going around not wearing Tampaxes or panty pads as a kind of feminist statement. It wasn't actually true. They gulled some poor women into thinking it was a thing with embarrassing consequences. There is all manner of fake news around, and there always has been, but I would say that the name we've given to it is inaccurate. What it really should be called is sour grapes. And the reason I say that is that the first time I heard of fake news, and it really was, it's quite a recent phrase. Before that, the current phrase was post-factual, post-truth. There was a kind of meme going on among the liberal left that right-wing people were making stuff up. The new version I first came upon when I was invited onto the BBC to discuss the fake news phenomenon. And I was going to say the things I'm going to say to you tonight, which is basically, look, left and right people, the competing political visions will always write stuff which is slanted, but that's how it goes. But instead, the first question the BBC asked me was, do you believe that Barack Obama was born in Hawaii? So they automatically imagine that because I write for an American conservative website, that I am prone to these conspiracy theories. The 2 obvious examples, and the reason the fake news issue came up at all on the BBC, it came just after the Brexit result. And I noticed that the fake news meme, as I would consider it, coincides with the fact that Donald Trump won and he wasn't expected to, and Brexit happened and that this wasn't expected to, at least among the established media. They were shocked, and they needed an excuse.
Just those couple of stories I mentioned at the beginning, because you're sceptical about the idea there is fake news. Those, the Pope endorsing Trump did go round. It was shared widely, and this claim that so-called Pizzagate, that there was a sex ring run from the basement of this restaurant. If you don't think that's fake news, how would you describe those two stories?
I think that the fake element is that the idea that it's in any way new or problematic. It's just a fashionable name for an old phenomenon. I don't believe that, for example, the Brexit vote was swung by the fact that people wrote £350 million on the side of a bus, although I'm always told this by Ramonas. In the same way, I don't believe it was the Russians that swung it for Donald Trump. These are just excuses. Fake news is not a problem.
And I get the point about it being not new, but let's say that allegation about the child sexting, why is that not a problem?
About the people who believe the Pizza Party Ben story, I think were already predisposed to hate Hillary Clinton. I don't think these were kind of natural voters who were suddenly swayed.
So it might not have a political impact. All right, let's go to you, Jimmy Wales. You started this new venture, Wiki Tribune, and I know we want to get, as our discussion goes on, beyond just diagnosing the problem. We do want to talk about possible remedies, accepting for the sake of this conversation that it is a problem. And you're already in the business of coming up with the remedy. So why don't you tell us what your plan is?
So Wiki Tribune is a new news platform, and it's an effort to bring together paid professional journalists and a wiki-style community to work together side by side as equals to produce something new in the field of news. And so the idea is to tap into deep networks of expertise, of quality people out there, but also to have professional journalists doing the kinds of things that it's been difficult or impossible for citizen journalists to do. But I think equally important to that, and part of the reason for that, or part of the thinking behind that is, the business model of journalism has become incredibly difficult. And we know that the business model is driving a lot of the low quality things that we see, from fake news that I would equate equivalent to spam. I mean, people just generating stuff that gets shared widely for no other reason than to get clicks, to clickbait headlines and various low quality media. And that's driven by advertising-only business model. And so the only way to get money is to get lots and lots of eyeballs looking at something, which drives you in a certain direction. And the high costs of journalism make it very hard to do quality work when you can only get slivers of revenue here and there. And so the idea is to have no advertising, but to have the readers contribute, to become monthly supporters. And that actually suddenly radically changes the business model as you think about what kind of things do we need to produce. So the BBC, for example, the business model of the BBC depends ultimately on the public accepting the license fee. And so they don't have to chase clicks all the time in the same way that other outlets may be forced to. You have outlets like BuzzFeed who do actually an admirable job of doing actual journalism, but in the early days of BuzzFeed, it was quite famous at being really good at clickbait headlines and viral content. And somehow, for some reason, they decided to do journalism as a side thing. I don't know why. Probably costs a lot of money. But it's interesting because when you talk to people about, in the business of journalism, they'll say, look, we really, we're journalists. We want to produce quality work, but we're under a lot of pressure just to get clicks and get them as cheaply as possible. And that's a fundamental problem with the model.
Good. We're going to hear more about your proposal in the course of the evening. Craig Silverman, I hope you're hearing all this. I mean, I just want to put to you, at least two people have raised the idea that it's not wholly new, that history is replete with examples of propaganda and even lies in the news, and yet we do have this new term and approaching it with new urgency. And so I'm just wanting to hear from you a sort of sharpened distinction between what we're grappling with now and what we had in the past, and whether maybe it's just because it goes viral so much more easily because of the internet.
Yeah, I mean, there's no disputing that misinformation has existed for a very long time, and there's also, I think, no disputing that the media has played a role in spreading false information at times throughout history. So what's different? Well, what's different is we have a platform like Facebook that almost 2 billion people log into every month. And that platform can make things pieces of content, news, get tremendous velocity, and as you say, go viral. And what's happened is because Facebook is such a massive traffic generator, it is a huge target for spammers and people who want to exploit it for economic means. And so what's happened is that news and traffic, in order to monetize them, people are coming up with different approaches on Facebook to try and get that traffic to make money from ads. And so the economic model for misinformation is probably more appealing and more global now than it's ever been. That is definitely something that's different. I mean, whether it's teenagers in Macedonia, spammers that I've encountered in Vietnam or Kosovo around the world, you have people who are trying to weaponize information in order to make money off of it. And one of the interesting things, which I think Tim alluded to in the election, was that arguably some of the propaganda stuff and actually the financially oriented fake news were kind of identical. The pro-Trump stuff was apparently perhaps something that Russia might have been trying to help influence. Again, I don't think Russia flipped the election. But that stuff was exactly the same as what the Macedonian teens were doing, because that's what earned the money for them. So we have a completely different media environment that is democratized, that is dominated by massive platforms that can make information go viral. And you layer into that also the fact that there's a tremendous amount of automation going on, and there are bots spreading false and fake information. So there are absolutely different elements to it. The reach of it and the velocity of it is absolutely different. And also the economic piece, I think, is different as well. A lot of those elements have been there before. They're just kind of supercharged now.
We should mention, because Craig mentioned Facebook, that we did indeed contact and seek a representative from Facebook on the panel tonight. And despite our best efforts, they repeatedly declined our invitation and so are not here. But I just thought I'd mention that since Craig had mentioned them. Who would like to pick up particularly anything Craig said? I mean, I hope you will, Tim. And one thing I'm interested in is the notion of whether or not it makes it, he was saying, Craig, that there's, whether it's political or commercial in a way, it doesn't make that much difference. Often they end up in the same place. And you made that distinction right at the beginning. I'm just wondering if in how we deal with it, we would deal with them differently because, because their origin and their motive is different.
Well, I think they have converged because the commercial incentives, the ones that Jimmy was talking about, have made it profitable for some platforms to push out previously that which government would be pushing out, gut propaganda. I mean, I think fake news and propaganda is very closely related. I want to take issue with this idea that because we've had fake news propaganda historically, that it's not a problem. We've had cancer for a long time. Also, it's a problem. Something can be historic and still needs to be fought over and over and over again. And even though it's been used occasionally by Western societies, I do associate the extensive use of propaganda with fascist ideologies and also with some of the most repressive political systems we've seen in history, and that's what I'm really concerned about. I think fake news and propaganda, I'd like to call it propaganda, are tied with, because of the efforts to sort of glorify victory, because of the ease with which you can use fake news to accuse your opponent of atrocities and try to destroy them, that I think it is closely linked to whatever has gone by the name of fascist or totalitarian ideologies over time. So I think we're fighting something more seriously than just like errors in journalism or trying to do error correction. We are fighting fascism. We are fighting domination by authoritarian figures, and that's why I think the fake news fight really matters.
Amanda, you wanted to come in.
Well, only I want to pick up and kind of agree with something James was saying in terms of I think there's a danger if we think that fake news is just right wing. Because it kind of lets us off. It puts us in a position of divorce from the political arena and labeling certain people with a certain view as the enemy and certain other people with another view as the good guys. And I don't think that's right. The reason I went into making something like the thick of it was a thing that Tony Blair said when he was trying to justify the invasion of Iraq and the fact that nothing was found. He said to his party conference that he did it because he thought it was the right thing to do. And he said, I only know what I believe, which, if you think about it, is the opposite of what most people have done for the last 3,000 years, which is examine and then... But what he raised was that thing of belief, faith, and it's what I was talking about earlier, feeling. If we just feel that way, it's placing that on the same level as fact. And that is something that happens across the spectrum. It's not necessarily a right way. I'm sure the Macedonian bloggers and fake news smiths, if they had discovered a way of making money out of Hillary Clinton being president, would have started to circulate stuff about Donald Trump. I think I think there's a danger we think this is too easy as a problem, or that it's just located with a certain identifiable group of people.
Really interesting. I want to bring in Jimmy in a second, but just one thing I wondered about, because we have been talking about clickbait, and I know the BBC doesn't have to be in that business, but is there partly a problem that the facts, the very strict and sort of plain facts of a story, are never going to be as exciting and as interesting and sort of viral as one of these made-up stories? You know, that thing about the Pope endorsing Trump was just compelling. Who wouldn't want to read that? And that the facts might be just a bit more dull, always, compared to fake news.
Well, so I remember my daughter saying that she got her news, I think it was from YouTube, and she said she didn't know if it was true or not, and she didn't mind, you know, because it was she took it as sort of entertainment.
Right.
And so it's slightly it's what you want from that. I think now people, you know, dull is suddenly fine. I think people are getting used to dull. But the thing about, I mean, it's back to definition of terms and what's fake news of actually sort of making stuff up and what is selected truth, or, you know, which is something you could accuse, I suppose, newspapers, or it depends what your view is, and therefore you find facts to fit it. And actually the belief, you mentioned crime, is a very interesting one, because the police do deal with that. You know, we know that actually putting 2 policemen on a street walking up and down is it's quite wasteful. You know, much better have, you know, intelligence-led sort of policing, but people feel reassured, you know. So I don't know if they feel reassured now seeing the army on the street. That's a discussion. But so some things have to be and politics is a lot about what people feel as well as what people think. So I think you have to be slightly more sort of imaginative in your outlook. You can't just say just facts are facts. Yeah.
You know, you need to tell a story, a sort of
Yes,
compelling story as
exactly,
well.
yeah.
Jimmy wanted to come in.
So, I mean, one of the things that I wanted to point out, and actually I think James might very much agree with this point, which is one of the reasons, so I absolutely do think of the majority of the true fake news that we've seen out there does tend to lean to the right. And that is that combination of both commercial and political. And if we want to understand why that is, right, there's a very comfortable out-of-touch metropolitan elite view that, well, it's just because people on the right have very poor analytical skills at understanding what's true and false.
I'm agreeing
It's
with
totally missing the point. You weren't supposed to agree with that part. No, but what is missing the point there is that there is a hunger by the public, that there are certain views which are to the right of London, whether they be on Brexit. There's a certain bunch of people who are very unhappy with Hillary Clinton and actually had a lot of appeal in the policies of Trump, although I find that harder to quite grasp because I can't figure out what his policies are. He's so random every day. And I do think that there has been a problem with a media echo chamber that's really right on insufficient levels of self-introspection and debate about whether we're taking into account all segments of society appropriately, which means there is a group of people out there who are susceptible to politically driven fake news, very hyped up news, you know, and they are well served by certain markets, even though you might step back and look at it and say, wow, this is not quality information. And there is something wrong, you know, that we're not, as the mainstream media, and in this country, I would say, for example, the Daily Mail is incredibly popular and is very much out of step with sort of the rest of the media. And, you know, I have social friends in common with you, and you know, that sort of world. They've got a market for it, and there's a reason for that.
Since you mentioned the Daily Mail, I mean, Wikipedia got a lot of attention for making a decision that the Daily Mail would no longer count as a reliable or trustable source.
Right.
I mean, is that because you believed what was in the Mail was fake news?
I think fake news is a very strong term. I would reserve that term to be really, you know, quite specifically made up out of thin air.
Wholly fabricated.
Wholly fabricated. But there are many examples in the Daily Mail of stories that are false and still on the website today. They like to brag about how few press complaints commission, whatever they are upheld against them. That's mostly because the stuff where they leave the stories up, there's nobody to actually sue them. One of my favorite, this is a great, you've got to do this. So when you go home, Google China giant TV smog. And there's this fantastic photo in the Daily Mail of a giant billboard television with a picture of the sunrise. And the headline says something like, China forced to put up giant TV so people can watch the sunrise due to the smog. It's a great story, right? And it ticks a lot of boxes of our prejudices about China and pollution. It's a very Daily Mail story. It's also completely false and has been widely debunked. But there's nobody to sue. Like, there's nobody, they didn't libel you and you didn't get on, why, how dare you? And then they go, okay, I'll take it down. It just sits there. And, you know, there are a lot of cases like that where I wouldn't call it fake news exactly, but it's not quality journalism.
Craig, I just want to go to Craig Silverman just for a second. I want you in a way to respond to the question that Sarah's daughter raised, which was the idea that, you know, she checks the news and, in a way, not that bothered whether it's true or not, it's entertaining. And I'm wondering what actually to you is the sort of cost of people reading things that they don't necessarily believe they're true, but they enjoy them and they're labeled news, but they may be not accurate. But what's the actual public harm here?
Well, I think it's going to depend on the story itself in some cases. I mean, if we think of classic tabloids like the National Enquirer in the United States, I mean, that was one of the biggest selling publications in the United States for a very long time, and it had stuff that was completely made up in it. And people read it, and it was entertaining. And maybe they believed it a little bit, maybe they didn't, but they were sort of happy with it because it gave them that moment. And this is something that I hear a lot about, and it's also something that when I talk to the people who do fake news for a living, commercially driven ones, not even the political stuff, but just making up the crazy stories that people like to share, you know, for them, they argue there's no harm. People, whether they believe it or not, it doesn't really change anything. But, you know, there's different segments to it. So one of them is if it's about politics and it changes people's perception of the world around them or how they vote, then obviously that would be a huge concern. The other one that I see a lot of, just to give one example, is that a lot of fake news stories in the United States use people's mug shots. So someone takes a mug shot, and maybe it's a kind of an extreme photo or a funny photo, and the next thing you know, people who create fake news will grab that photo and pair it with a completely made-up story. And so in that sense, is there a cost to society? Well, maybe that's harder to argue than that actual person who maybe, you know, committed a crime or in the end might have been acquitted or never fully charged with it, and all of a sudden their photo lives on in infamy on the internet. So I think there can absolutely be different degrees of consequences. We also have to consider what the overall societal cost is if we have more and more of the nonsense and fake stuff getting as much traction and in some cases more virality than the real stuff. What does that do to us over time? The cumulative effect, I think, is something that concerns me.
Right, and I was going to go to you on this, Tim, but others might want to jump in. This point about how we make decisions as a society, and this is like Sarah's example about the crime, or Amanda's example about the crime figures, Newt Gingrich and the crime figures. If we actually don't know what the crime figures are, it's very hard to draw up a criminal justice policy, so you need people to agree on a basic set of facts. With that in mind, and I'm going to do this partly, and I will give you a chance to come back, but because of some of the things you've written about climate change, somebody who denies human-made climate change, would you want to say that's a different opinion, or would you want to slap a fake news label on that?
I might. There was a lot in the United States of corporate propaganda. You know, I think some of the greatest propagandists are corporations. And I think when it's disingenuous, when it you know, sort of represents a view of a tiny percentage and exaggerates it into a debate, that is propaganda, that is fake news, and that she resisted. I don't think it should be censored, but I think it should be called what it is. I want to also just take great exception to this view that, you know, fake news is something that everyone does, and, you know, Blair did and so forth. I think that that understates the problem significantly. I think that fake news and propaganda is always the tool of the extremist. Now, I agree that you'll have it on the far left. The Soviet Union used a lot of fake news on its citizens, and, you know, the Third Reich used it on their citizens, but it is always the tool of someone who doesn't have a better argument. You know, why do you go to fake news? It's because you can't win the argument in the center. Why is there climate change denialism? It's because they can't win the regular scientific debate, right? Why do corporations resort to inventing, in the United States, we're always inventing campaigns and, you know, even now having robots who comment? It's because you can't win the political debate. And that is a grave danger for an open society that relies on the idea of public opinion mattering, because it moves people back to like, well, maybe we have to completely count the public out and just have them out of it and have experts decide. That's what some people start thinking about it. No, I think it's a grave danger to the ability of society to make decisions at all And if you want to have an open society that makes good decisions, you really need to fight propaganda hard.
Very good. Amanda's going to come in, but James should come back on your position on fake news. Sorry, your position on climate change. Some have branded to be fake news.
Tim had two shots, didn't he, actually, before mine. And the first one, he did the clever rhetorical, well, rather devious rhetorical trick, where he said, yeah, we've had cancer with us for a long time. So like fake news is like cancer. He's planted that idea in your minds. What about fake news is like bad weather? It's been with us all the time. We can both play these games. Craig, if I can just briefly pick up on his point, because I don't think the case has been made that fake news is a bad thing. I really don't. One of Craig's arguments was that people are making money out of it. Well, my goodness. Anyone who works in the media today knows how damned hard it is to make money out of any form of journalism. If kids in Macedonia are making a living by making stuff up, I say fair play to the kids of Macedonia. But to return to Tim's deeply objectionable point, I was going to develop this later on, but since we're here, we may as well go there. This is the arrogance of the liberal media, thinking that its version of events is the correct one. He can't even countenance the possibility that those on the skeptical side of the climate argument might actually be right, might actually marshal evidence to support their case. And it seems to me that he's missing a key element of what journalism is about. It is about making a case, whether you're on the left or the right. That is your job. It doesn't matter what label you attach to it. It is about making a case, using arguments, using logic, using quotes from people that you've gathered. But the idea that Tim can just suddenly declare that this is kind of, he implied, funded by sinister interests, that seems to me quite wrong, because that's his opinion. But I don't think that it is the only opinion. I think there are other valid opinions out there.
Okay, but you just said it's his opinion, but what if there's facts and evidence and data that he can draw on?
Well, it's interesting you say that. One of the more lamentable trends in our universities in the last 20 years, and this is what Leopold Bloom wrote about, is that there is this thing, relativism, that there is no such thing as truth. Actually, I think the job of journalists has been, and always will be, ultimately, to try and find the truth. It's just that it's not necessarily what people from the New York Times say it is. There are other, well, I mean, I would argue that I'm right, basically.
All right, good. We were certainly not going to open up the whole climate change argument, because we mustn't do that.
Well, you did it.
It's my fault.
You started
my bad. I just wanted to talk about the issue itself rather than drilling into it. But, Amanda, you wanted to come in right at the beginning.
Well, okay. There's so much to kind of come in on now. Right. Wind back, first of all, accusing people who make fake news of cowardice, of not wanting to take part in the discussion, in the debate, is fine, but we have to apply that to both sides of the argument. I think on too many occasions, people on for the want of a better phrase, the liberal left, have concluded that they are right in any argument and that things are obvious, and that those who don't agree with them are supplying falsehoods. For example, I voted Remain, and I was deeply disappointed that Brexit happened, but I was absolutely shocked by the attitude of key Remainers for quite some time, which is, well, you just got it wrong, because our argument is the true argument. And I think you have to fight against that. What
about the 350 million, which?
Well, exactly. All I'm saying is on both sides. But I think it's lazy to think that all these facts exist. For example, in the climate change argument, yes, truth is difficult to find, but there are facts. And I think you form your opinion on climate change on examining the facts. I think people who argue in favor of climate change forget that they have to keep reminding people of how they arrived at that conclusion. The onus is on us, or whoever it is that's supplying that opinion, to keep backing it up. You can't just state that it's obvious, and therefore I don't have to do anything else.
This is going to be brief. On this particular question, the BBC always used to have a thing where if there was an opinion offered, they would say, some people say this, others say that, critics argue this. Has there been any discussion in the BBC about whether, or, let's say, for example, about the crowd sizes of Donald Trump's inauguration, where anybody who looked at the photographs thought that that crowd was smaller than that crowd. But would the BBC still feel the need to say, according to Donald Trump, that was the bigger crowd? Or would the BBC feel confident saying, that was the bigger crowd? Where have you come to?
Yeah, I've only been here 3 weeks, so I'm not sure I can speak for the BBC yet. I mean, it's an interesting one, because that crowd, because I do remember, actually, it was Charles Moore picking up on how often crowd sizes are, that we take a figure that isn't verified, and I think the example he gave of was the march that came afterwards, which was described as millions had anyone checked, Yeah. I think on the whole, people accept from a picture that you can see there weren't that many people, but there wasn't a totally satisfactory figure. But I agree, just saying one person says this, one person says that.
You don't want sort of critics argue that the world is round.
No, I think what you want, it's back to actually what you want is a kind of some spirit of scientific inquiry, don't you? You want to be open, and I think that is a thing of Brexit, because actually what was interesting there, I noticed that having said you're wrong, then the implication was, so you're wrong, so you'll realise you're wrong and you'll feel remorseful. And interestingly, that didn't happen. That actually people became more convinced, that the Brexiteers became more convinced they were right. There wasn't the remorse that everyone was expecting. So it doesn't work if you just fight. If you just fight it in terms of opinion. I think you just have to go back to the beginning, as you say, and start making a case.
So which has got us nicely to where I wanted us to pivot, which is into remedies and solutions. We're just going to take it for the sake of this part of the argument that there is a problem here to be addressed. So naturally, I'm going to look to you, Jimmy, because you've got into the business now of proposing a solution. Besides your own project with Wiki Tribune, what else in the broader news universe needs to happen to deal with this problem?
So yeah, I was going to say, I can talk about the things I won't solve, but I think there are pieces of the puzzle that are out there that need to be solved. And one of the biggest is things spreading virally through Facebook. And what happens there, more than anything else, is that fake news stories, and let's pick something uncontroversially, just completely made up, Pope endorses Trump, got shared tens of thousands of times. And what happens is, then these websites, they look like news websites. They've got all the signifiers. There's a masthead and some ads, and it looks like a news and byline and so on. And it spreads virally through communities of people who are not avid news junkies. And I think it's perfectly valid in the world that some people shouldn't have to pay attention to the news. That's not for everybody, and that's okay. And the problem is, in a slightly different set of historical facts, we might be sitting up here all freaking out that Facebook has decided to determine for us which news we should be seeing. That sort of unbelievable power of Facebook to shape the dialogue is something that people on the left and on the right, and I think all parts of the political spectrum, it makes us nervous. That's really like very Big Brother-ish. And at the same time, we kind of want Facebook to help do something about this. And I do think there are things that they can do that are okay. So, I mean, one of the things I want Facebook to do, if I'm about to share something, and it's been debunked by third-party fact checkers, and it's sort of well known that this is a problem, I just want them to warn me, to say, something to the effect of, you might be about to look like an idiot in front of your friends. You might want to go check this before you share it. A lot of people have said this is fake. And then let me share it if I want to. And that's slightly mild and gentle enough to just give a warning now and then.
But that's very interesting if you get that warning just before you press send or whatever, or press share. But what about, should it just appear on Facebook saying this has been flagged up as suspect?
But there is a really difficult thing. If it's just, this has been flagged as fake, then you get brigades of people just flagging stuff as being fake because they don't like it.
Because they don't like it, yeah.
You don't want a situation, he may write a column, an opinion piece about climate change, where he sort of, puts forth his views that, I don't really want Facebook to sort of flag up his opinion as being problematic, and you put in
Jimmy, that is the problem. That is what's going to happen.
That's why it's really
Facebook
hard.
has a liberal bias.
Absolutely.
Well, obviously people on the other side, I'm doing a BBC thing now, people on the other side of that argument would say that Facebook doesn't have a liberal.
I think objectively speaking it does have a liberal bias.
Well, let's go to Craig Silverman, because I've wanted to hear from you. We're on remedies now. What do we want from Facebook? And Google are obviously absolutely central in disseminating this information. There was a big argument started here when somebody typed in essentially about the Holocaust, and Google came back with a whole set of answers that directed you to Holocaust denial website. So what do we want from Google? What do we want from Facebook? To you, Craig.
Well, I think one piece of it, to go with the point that's been made previously, is part of what we want is also what we don't want, which is them stepping in and exerting even more influence over things. And so for me, I think the first step is, well, what I want is transparency from them as the first step. Because if there are people who feel they have a liberal bias, if there are people who feel that they favor some pages over other pages, the only way for them to address that is to actually be far more transparent than they are. And the only way that we can be assured of the things that they're going to do, the technical measures to adjust the algorithms and other things to lower the distribution of fake stuff, the only way we can be assured about there not being crazy unintended consequences from that is for more transparency. So that's probably the first piece. I think they do have a technical responsibility to do things. I'm wary of putting any more power in their hands. I think especially in Facebook's case, 7 months ago, before the US election, they did not really want to engage on this topic. They wanted to stay away from it as much as possible. Now they're engaging, which on one level is good, but on the other level, we have to be hugely concerned because when they make an algorithm tweak, it changes the fortunes of places. It changes the different information that people see. So they have a role. I think Facebook is right to go after the 100% fake stuff and to not completely create blacklists and other things that threaten free speech. But I think step one is more transparency from them about not just what they're doing, but how that's being implemented, and then actually giving data to third-party researchers so they can analyze what's actually going on. The last part of it is that these platforms are so big, Facebook and Google don't know everything that's happening on their platforms. It's actually impossible for them to do that, so we need more third parties to have access to the data to actually say, hey, we found some huge problems here that you guys need to address.
It's very interesting what you say about transparency. The Guardian did reveal this week the so-called Facebook files, which showed the manuals that Facebook are using, and it was quite striking what they were, their own guidance to their own moderators about what they'd allow through and what they wouldn't. To you, Tim Wu, and then I want to just go around a little bit on what we should do ourselves, and then we're going to open up. So just a brief answer from you, Tim. This idea that should Facebook and Google be sort of have to come out as publishers and admit that they are no different really from the BBC or the Guardian or the New York Times, and take all the responsibility that goes with it.
No, absolutely. So, first of all, I want to say if it's arrogance to speak for the truth, then I will plead guilty. I think I feel a very solid ground saying that, to respond to this other things, that we need people fighting for the truth, and we have drifted very far. Cancer may be too far, but we have recurrent problems that come. Propaganda has seeped into our news system because of the uncertainty, because of the change in business models, and we need to fight it, and I'm not ashamed to say that at all. As for what Google and Facebook should be doing, because I'm an American, I feel I can say this, that the American faith in transparency is way overstated, and transparency remedies do nothing. Like, look at privacy, for example. Oh, you have to be transparent about how invasive you are of people's privacy. Does that stop anything? No. People just click and be like, okay, I've just given away all my privacy. I don't think fake news gets cured at all by transparency regimes. I think that fundamentally, you keep saying we don't want to give Facebook any more power. The power is already there. If you don't want to give Facebook power, quit. Or break them up. Don't be like, oh, you can't do something. They are already a leading media power. It's too late if that's going to be the problem. They're already creating the media environment we live in, so they need to clean up their act and be a little more responsible. Marvel Comics, with great power comes great responsibility. They're already doing it. They're doing a huge amount to create this environment. I think they have to clean up their act and not, fool around with transparency algorithms. But
how should they be made to clean up their act?
Well, I'm not saying they should be made to. I think they should take I think they are beginning to do this. And I think they need to take the ethical responsibility of saying, okay, it's not like one hand on the other hand. There is this thing called fake news. It happens. This is what he was trying to do.
What might pressure them to do that? They're making billions.
So maybe they can compare themselves with Wikipedia and feel a sense of shame. I mean, Wikipedia, I think, is a model in this world. You don't hear about Wikipedia. Occasionally, people sabotaging things.
A lot of love for Wikipedia.
We'll try.
I mean, you have occasional sabotage on Wikipedia. You have your problems, but you don't have stuff sticking around forever that's completely absolutely off the scale. I mean, you do have entries for comic book heroes, which are longer than for major historical figures, which is a little bit of an issue, and minor bit characters on popular dramas. But I can deal with that. But I think Wikipedia, despite all the critics, trusted source. Whatever Wikipedia did, Facebook can do too. They have, one way or another figured out this problem, and I hate this equivocating, we're going to do something small. I think they need to take action.
Thank you. There's much more I would ask all of you, but I want to hear now from our audience. So we're going to have people with microphones moving among you. Do put up your hand if you would like me to come to you. And probably keep your hands there until I can see. Okay, microphone number 2. Do you have someone there? You've already got someone there, so look good. Let's keep that there. And you've already got somebody at number 1, which is good. Let's bring, if there's a third microphone, or perhaps microphone number 1 when you're finished, find another person there. But let's hear from the person who's already there. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Thank you so much. Really, really fascinating. I just wanted to ask a question and just hear opinions, really. If you think that part of the problem is calling everything news, you've kind of all alluded at some points that some of it's just content, some of it's for entertainment, some of it's an opinion piece. So are we kidding ourselves as readers are we letting ourselves be misled and placing the blame on journalism and news organizations, and actually we should say, we've just watched a really crazy video.
It's not news.
It's not news, exactly.
Really interesting, thank you. Let's hear the question number 2, yeah.
Just to pick up on Tim's point there, Jimmy, if you could Wikipedia Facebook, how would you do it?
And by Wikipedia Facebook, meaning make it a wiki model, is that what you mean? Yeah, thumbs ups to there. Thank you. And then we've got question number 3. Somebody's already there. Yeah.
It's really a follow-on from the first question, that you've referred to it as fake news and propaganda. Why not lies, and where do you see the distinction?
Thank you. Well, let's go with that first. Armando, to you, why do we not just call this stuff lies rather than these very convoluted formulations about post-truth and all that?
It is, but as everyone's been saying, it's sold as a form of entertainment. But part of the problem is the medium now means that I started off, the very first TV show I did was fake news. It was the Day-to-Day. It was a spoof news program.
So that was fake?
That was fake. but yeah, the horses on the underground, everything. It was all false. But we could do that then because we knew what the news was. There was a commonly agreed idea of what the news was. It was Jeremy Paxman, it was the BBC, it was ITV. The news outlets there were only 4 or 5 main news channels. And now it's not just the spread of 24-hour news and online news, but the fact that the medium itself, the web, allows anyone to make anything look like it's The Guardian, or everything is now looks like it's of the same, it gives authority to anything. That's the problem.
This was Jimmy's point about how a story on Facebook actually can look no different from a Guardian on New York Times.
Yeah, and it might just say the Guardian. Or,
the famous one was the Denver Guardian.
Yeah.
Which was a perfect name because people have heard of Denver, it's a city in America, but who knows what the name of the newspaper is?
Yeah.
Right. Guardian sounds like a newspaper, and it looked like a...
It sounds like a newspaper.
Like a normal local newspaper.
Not anymore.
Sure.
And that is a problem. And just going back, the other thing I feel is that because we now, I just wonder whether we've got so used to the idea that we can't believe anything, that the whole world just feels fake to us, and the people who wanted to protest elections and wherever are doing it partly because they think, is this real? I don't know. Let's push this button and see what happens.
What do you think, Sarah, about this use of the word news? Would it be useful to start using that word a bit less, perhaps, and really narrow down what we meant by news?
There was a word called infotainment at some point, but what happened to that? I guess it's a word that they use naturally. Exactly.
It's a word
so if it's the word people use, is that what it was? Oh, let's restore it. It's what people say. Oh, I've got some news, and what we're talking about is a complete democratization of what people regard as news. So it's a tricky one. You can either, the BBC, big sort of trusted brand that people know, so that's all right. But I sort of have faith that in the end, the truth settles. And if you look at the arc of a story, even if it's sort of Manchester or something, it always starts with something's happened, which everyone wants to know about. There are lots and lots of information, some right, some wrong, some theories right, some theories wrong. Finally, you get a picture of what really happened. So it's just whether you're prepared to be patient, I think. And news is when you actually know what happened.
Let's just do a little bit of another survey here for a second, which is, just raise your hand if you feel you have ever, even on a very small level, been taken in by something that you later realized was fake news. Wow. In fact, I'm going to put my hand up too for that. Good, so it's quite a good number. Keep your hand up if you would like to tell us about it. And you've just got an example. Jimmy, why don't you tell us your one while we look for other people? Yeah.
Yeah, this is a good one. And partly, I think the Evening Standard was taken in by it as well. There was a story
George Osborne's Evening Standard? Or Go on.
I'm not having a go at anybody,
No,
I'm just saying. No, but part of the point is, it is easy to be taken in. Yeah. And one of the things that, so here was the story. It was a story from Jackson, Mississippi, about a couple. They were trying to have a child. They were having trouble conceiving. They went in for fertility treatments. And as a part of the testing, they discovered that they were twins. Oh, wow, like that's heavy, and it's a great human interest story. It also pretty much reflects most people's view of what Jackson, Mississippi must be like. I'm from Alabama, trust me, I know. And yet, with a little bit of closer inspection, you see they didn't name the doctor, they didn't name the clinic. After this story was published and was picked up by several news outlets, including, sadly, the Evening Standard, it was debunked quite quickly, and turns out it was a variant of a story that had appeared on a notorious fake news site, and it just spread. And it was such a great story that people said, oh yeah, and it was also plausible. It was the Mississippi Herald, so a plausible sounding name for a thing. Yes. And it's not that hard to get taken in by some of this stuff.
Can I just tell you, when we were doing the radio version of the Day-to-Day on the Hour, we nearly, within 10 seconds, came close to getting a spoof story on the Today programme that we had made about cows rising from the dead in an abattoir in Bristol. And it was all set to go, and John Humphreys was writing his introduction to it when the day editor said, "Who wrote this story again?" And it was Chris Morris.
Oh, excellent. Well, he was in a way of creating this and satirizing this before anyone else, along with you. Is someone else putting a hand up with an example of a fake news experience they've had? So the lady here is waving her hand. If we can bring the microphone to you. It's going to get the atmosphere of sort of people testifying in a revivalist church as they admit they lapsed into sin, and then we'll come to number 3 in a minute. Yeah.
I was somewhat taken in, briefly, by Pizzagate, and I still have my doubts, because it was never actually properly debunked. What was he referring to in those emails? It was code for something. And I think it's a great example of where an argument was not made to counter. I mean, obviously, the ritual sacrifice stuff was nonsense. But I still have questions. I mean, was it drugs? Was it drugs? There was a code going on in those emails. What was it?
I mean, the reason partly why I brought it up was because there was an example of fake news with consequences. Because, as you remember, an armed man went in with, an automatic weapon and was ready to kill people, and was persuaded partly because he'd heard that there was a child sex ring in the basement of this restaurant, and there was no basement. But let's just hear from the person who's at microphone number 3. Yeah.
Hi, I think this was fake news. I'm still not 100% sure, but I saw a picture of Donald Trump on my Facebook feed, and next to it was a quote that effectively said that if I ever were to run for a political party, I would run for the Republicans because they're the stupidest voters. And I think that was debunked post, but I fell for it at the time.
I fell for that as well.
You fell for that as well, because and you fell for it presumably because it tapped into something you already believe.
No. It's that thing of you gravitate towards the stories that you really want to believe in. And you shy away from the ones, or you ignore the ones that dispute what it is you believe in. And
Craig Silverman's been very patient. I want to go to you, Craig, on the question that was put here in the hall, which was, could you do a Wikipedia of Facebook? Because we've heard that Wikipedia have managed, admirably to more or less, not always, but weed out things that are not true. Could that be done on Facebook?
So I think one really big challenge to start with is the scale of Facebook, the amount of content. I think it's something like 300 million links shared every week on Facebook. So if you want to have humans doing some kind of review process on that, it's probably not scalable. However, you could probably come up with an idea to look something kind of like what Facebook used to have for its trending product. If you remember, you see the little list of trending topics. At one point, they had a group of editorial staffers who were kind of validating the topics that the algorithm would sort of spit out. And Facebook decided to get rid of them. And they got rid of them before their algorithm was good enough to not promote stuff that was totally false. And obviously, there were some concerns that in the selection of those humans, were they too liberal and were they suppressing conservative sources was one piece of it. So I think, are there human-machine combination models? Yes. And if we're talking about Facebook, they do that to a certain extent. The way that they, for example, suppress clickbait is that they have actual humans doing the drudge work of human labeling. Yes, this is a clickbait headline that withholds information. No, this is not. And then the machines go and learn that and then try to make their guesses. So I think Facebook has a bit of that, but I can't imagine they will ever want to have editors in there because they view humans as too messy, as too hard to scale, and potentially too biased.
And maybe expensive, but Tim...
No, I want to ask him, well, how then does Facebook manage to take care of pornography? And Google as well. I mean, you would think that this would be very attractive material to a lot of viewers. Yet somehow they magically manage to weed it out. But magically they can't weed out other things. This has always been a question for me. I wonder if you have an answer.
Well, I mean, I think the stuff that actually The Guardian leaked does give us a bit of a roadmap on that, is that they have to have a bunch of humans create rules of what is and what isn't pornography or violence or what have you. And then they have to hire a bunch of people to do it in combination with algorithms. So it's not impossible, but I do think one of the big hesitations that Facebook has is of doing this with news is that they're going to get hammered from the left and from the right on it. And I just think they're really hesitant to do that. Overall, I would say, however, that Facebook recently announced they're hiring 3,000 more people to do content review for violence, for pornography, and that kind of thing. And I don't know what the number is, but I think they've got a hell of a lot more people that they need to hire because the platform is so big and the machines alone cannot do it to a good enough degree yet that I do think they need to scale the human effort. And could they do it in news? Potentially. Will they ever? Honestly, I just think they don't want to go anywhere near that.
And as we said, we did try and get someone from Facebook here. Before I go back to members of our audience, I want to ask you something, Sarah, because you mentioned I think it was again, perhaps your daughter, but or somebody else, but who said that they check Google News and then they go to a more trusted provider. We've been talking mainly about what the providers can do, the producers of content. Is there a burden on us, the consumers of news? Do we need to get our act together and only stick, really, and only look at reputable, verifiable online, journalism, and perhaps take responsibility for what we consume rather than hoping that, the great Facebook in the sky is going to take care of it for us?
Yeah, because I think, the consumers are also the producers. That's the point. So that's what citizen journalism is. So it's a fantastic thing. But I think you just have to remember the point of journalism is that you're trying to find things out. And there was a very good quote from, was it David Hareplay, possibly Pravda, about the sort of monster proprietor, where he said, in my house I have a library full of books. I've never read any of them because I've already made up my mind. And I think that's the, that's the point, that true journalists should start by wanting to find something out, not going with preconceptions. It's hard, but you should try.
Sure, but the question in a way to consumers of news, is there a bigger responsibility on us to filter what we look at more rigorously? Let's see if some hands are up and people have got questions. There's a gentleman there wearing a white shirt, I think. Let's go to you, and then we'll carry on. Yeah.
Well, it really follows on from that question. I wondered if we're completely misidentifying the problem. Fake news has been around forever. Technology may have increased its velocity, but fake news has been around forever. So perhaps we should zoom out, and maybe the problem is the state of, is education, perhaps. Our education systems are too focused on rote learning and following instructions. Perhaps we're not equipped to interrogate facts, think tangentially. Numeracy, amongst otherwise very intelligent people, is terrible. If you can't work out what 6 zeros after a number is and divide it by the approximate size of the economy, how can you sort of think about anything a politician says?
few red
So
faces.
perhaps
something.
there's
Yes, struggling with that one, yeah.
So perhaps we're misidentifying the problem by talking about the perpetrators of fake news, and perhaps it's more a societal problem.
Yes, thank you. Simon, by number 4, we've got a question there.
Yeah, this is about responsibility again, and whether that's on the consumer or the purveyor of information. I just wondered if the panel had any views about whether or not sites such as, let's use Facebook as the example, should be mandated to, and I know Tim said that transparency doesn't work, but the fact is that 2 billion people use this platform, and most of the people who use this, and I count most of the people in this room amongst them, don't understand what happens when they click stuff and when they write stuff and what that means about how likely it is that other people are going to see it. It's not just about pressing share on something. Every time you write a comment under an article on Facebook, even if the comment is, this is bullshit, why are you all commenting on this? It makes it more likely that other people are going to see that. They might not see your comment saying it's bullshit, they're just more likely to see it. People don't know that. People don't get it. Is there a duty of care on Facebook to at least reveal how that stuff works?
Thank you. And by position number 2.
Yeah. Thanks for doing this tonight. My question is interesting to hear folks talk about this has been around for a long time. Maybe it's Google and Facebook's fault. But I guess a question for each panelist, scale of 1 to 10. Is this an issue in our society today because one politician gave this news currency?
Who are you talking about there?
You know.
Okay.
Theresa May.
Who did use the term fake claims, I think.
Who did what?
Did she not talk about fake claims this week?
She
So
did
it's
use the
already
term
it's
fake
a
claims.
comment.
She accused Jeremy Corbyn of making
Yeah.
fake claims about her policy. So microphone number 3.
So Tim mentioned Blair really, really briefly, but do you not think that after the Chilcot inquiry, people would just naturally not trust the British media that supported the Iraq war, since it's been proved that Blair was mostly lying about a lot of those claims?
Thank you. There will be, obviously people will question that too. I want to get one or two more in. We just had a run of male questioners, and I'm quite keen, people who've seen me do this before, to have a bit of a gender balance. So let's get microphone number 1.
Hello, I don't know whether people are standing up, but I wonder whether there's a combination of both the Wikipedia kind of model for Facebook and also responsibility on consumers. And I say that because I remember my dad shared a Britain First thing on Facebook, and I wrote saying, I'm not sure whether you've checked the source of this. And I think people don't necessarily know where things are coming from, but it might take their family members and friends to kind of maybe explain things or kind of
So you
point
think
things
there's a
out.
responsibility on family members and friends to do this, to point out where...
A combination of the two, I
Yes,
think, yeah.
interesting, thank you. This might be the last one, I'm afraid, at microphone number 3, there we go.
Hi, I want to go back to the gentleman who raised that point about zooming out a bit. And for me, this feels a bit that it's about stories and storytelling. And I wonder what you think to... So personally, since Brexit, I've retreated from news reading and started reading a lot of fantasy books. And actually, that's really... And I hadn't noticed I was doing it. I picked it up, and I wondered if there's something about how maybe where we are at this point as a Western society, where maybe we lack that bigger narrative, that clarity about where we're going. Maybe it's a bit easier to sink into these smaller stories that are more compelling and easier.
I think that's fascinating. Thank you for all of those questions. What I'm going to do, we're at the point where we're going to get closing remarks from all of you, but I will ask you all to just address at least one of the questions that came up as we do so. So you're actually first up for this, James. Let me see if there's one of any of these questions that well, why don't you choose? In fact, you know what? Because most likely we had somebody there suggest that a person who bears big responsibility for this is Donald Trump, because I think even you, James, would concede he has not always been scrupulous about the facts.
No, I think he's great. I think he's perfect.
I know you think he's great, but he hasn't always been scrupulous. So why don't you address that?
Hasn't put it wrong. No, you said I could answer which question I wanted. I liked the girl who said that she's turned to fantasy novels, because I think that probably George R.R. Martin has more to tell us about contemporary politics than any newspaper. Can I very, very briefly raise 2 really key points which no one's mentioned, and I think it's rather sad. One is, we had an experiment at the beginning where you were all asked, which of these 3 stories you believed. most of you knew which was the fake news story. I think we're forgetting sometimes the wisdom of crowds, that people are actually capable of discerning. And there is this kind of elitist assumption that people are thick, they don't know what's good for them, therefore they need these signposts from the authorities, from Facebook. I'm not sure I agree with that. And the second thing is there's a concerning issue about censorship and freedom of speech. After all, John Milton wrote in Areopagitica a defense of free speech. And one of the things he said is that bad ideas need to be out there, being exposed, so that we can discern the bad ideas from the good ideas. And I think we're in danger of forgetting that in favor of an authoritarianism run by people whose judgment is not necessarily any better than the people they're passing judgment on.
Okay, thank you. Equally concise if you can. Sarah Sands, to you. What about this notion that, let me have a look, see which one I want to put to you. Well, about education. Should it now be part of children's education in this country that they learn to interrogate social media and Facebook and what pops up on their phone? Should that be actually something that is part of the curriculum?
Yeah, I think actually it was a really good idea, and that should be part of education anyway, of a sort of training a mind to interrogate, back to this sense of inquiry. So that sounded very sensible to me. The other thing I would just say, to sum up, and slightly supporting sort of James on this, that I do think people will work. We're in pretty uncharted territory in all this. There's a huge amount of information. We've seen already this flight to quality. We've seen that people actually do value expertise when they just have to see who they trust. But we know actually scientists are pretty trusted. We know teachers are pretty trusted. We know doctors are pretty trusted. And so I think, in the end, I'm pretty optimistic about it all. I think, as I say, the sort of truth comes out. It's just not immediate.
So closing thought from you, Armando, and I thought you might perhaps address this point, the question raised, which is that did the rot set in with Iraq, and you mentioned Tony Blair yourself before, not just the politicians who said there were weapons of mass destruction, but the media that did row in behind them. Did that mean that media lost a lot of credibility and trust and prepare the ground for fake news?
It was the perfect storm of an administration which had a huge majority, so could have actually done quite a lot, but was obsessed with the media. And it was a media that was obsessed with getting access to the government. And it was an administration that was obsessed with trying to control the agenda. So all of those sort of little elements there brewed into this thing, which is the Iraq thing, which was, strangely enough, for a politician who had spent all his time trying to work out what people wanted, it was the first time he acted on his own belief. And the invasion of Iraq, and completely ignored what everyone was telling him would go badly wrong. I want to pick up on the education thing, actually, because there's another thing we haven't really discussed, which is we should not just debate social media, we should debate. I mean, it used to be something that I grew up in the sort of Scottish debating tradition, and it was really fantastic. It's a fantastic discipline to have a proposal, to debate it for 10 minutes, and then to be told 10 minutes in to swap sides and have to think in the mind of your opponent. And I think we shy away from having discussions with people who disagree with us. If we actually believe, if we have confidence in our own faith and our own conclusions, they should be able to withstand attack from someone else. And I think what we do instead is retreat to those who agree with us. And we see anyone who disagrees with us, not just as an opponent, but it's somehow offensive, that we're being offended, our views are being ridiculed. And in fact, they're not. They're being challenged, and we should be confident enough. We should be confident about facts. If we believe in facts, we should be confident enough to use them. I'd really like to bring, in addition to like Tinder and Grindr and Fender and all these other, I want to propose an app that puts you in touch with someone who has diametrically opposite views as you.
Very interesting.
And I'd call it Ponder.
swipe left or swipe right. You could do either. That's a really good idea.
Very clever.
I'm guessing in this room there's probably half a dozen internet startup entrepreneurs already quietly stepping out to set that up. Craig Silverman, obviously closing remarks from you, but one thing I wanted to put to you was the question about, from the woman who said she's found herself, her word, retreating from news and reading fantasy instead. And it just put in my mind this idea that there is a tendency, perhaps more pronounced, on the liberal or left end of the spectrum to really obsess over facts. And does it mean that people have, on that side of the argument, forgotten the power and appeal of story and narrative? And actually, maybe that's what the side that one might want to brand fake news have going for them, is they do know the power of storytelling. And perhaps the other side is just in the business of selling dry facts that are so dry, people end up running off to read fantasy instead.
There is, I think, a real challenge and also a difference between the sort of emotion-driven side, which is really what performs well on Facebook, and the very clinical, bloodless, facts-only side. And this is one of the challenges that we have of just knocking down misinformation in general, is that when you come at it from the pose of the debunker, which is something I do a lot, you just look like a know-it-all, and you look like an annoying person wagging your finger at everyone. And if you're just doing it in purely factual terms, you can't really compete with emotion. And so I think there's a lot of complex things going on, but a lot of it, I've talked a lot about platforms and technology and that kind of thing. At the core of it is really, human, our emotions, the way our brains work. We are drawn to things that align with what we already think and what we already feel, and the algorithms exasperate that. So I think people are not only retreating to fantasy, but they're also retreating into kind of their own ideological bubble. And the last thing I would just say is I think this has come up a couple of times where people focus on conservatives and the right and their fake news. But since Trump has been elected, if you look at the really hyper-partisan liberal Facebook pages and websites, they are getting huge engagement because now they have an enemy. And there is absolutely a lot of misinformation coming from that side as well now. And so, again, it's not even about the sides. It's about us as humans and how we interact with the information in the world around us. And that's at the core of this challenge. That's why it's been around forever. But when those things become mediated by algorithms on huge platforms, suddenly it takes on another approach. So it is a complex problem, and it comes down to us as humans, I think, at the end of the day.
Thank you. Tim Wu, a closing thought from you. One of the questions that came up was whether there should be some kind of responsibility on Facebook, that they, when you're posting to the user, should know more about what's going to happen to the piece that they post, how it's going to get seen and it's going to go viral, even if they are trying to debunk that piece.
Right. No, yeah, I think it's optimistic to expect people to understand the algorithms of Facebook. If I can choose my question, I also want to make a comment on the book, the retreat to books, not only because I'm an author. But I think there's another message in there, which is we are too dependent on news as entertainment. We somehow have come to think that news has to be entertaining. If you want entertaining, then read books. And maybe you don't need to spend think about how you spend your time and attention and whether you spend it, why do you need to always be on Facebook? Can you start at that level? And I think that's an important observation, is we demand too much from our news that it be too entertaining for us. I personally write books about the broad sweep of history and the rise and falls of civilizations. And I think these issues are really serious. And I think the Iraq War comment really brings it slightly to a head. That, people are saying, what fake news took you in that was the most important? Clearly that was the worst, or the most important fake news in the last 20 years, even more than some random story about Pizzagate or whatever. I was taken in, I think a huge number of people believed that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, or they didn't have conclusive, or a nuclear bomb in a briefcase. And so an open society two open societies at least, made some of the worst decisions they've ever made. So many people died on the basis of fake news. That is the cost of fake news in a nutshell. Trillions of dollars spent, tens of thousands of people dying because of something someone made up for political reasons. And that's what I'm scared about in our environment. I believe that the creation over the long term of an objective media, of something called a journalist who has a profession, is a serious achievement of civilization. And we are facing its unraveling, and I think we need to fight it if open societies are going to continue to have an advantage. John Stuart Mill's idea of the advantage of open societies was that they are able to debate two ideas and come to a better conclusion. But that presupposes an actual real debate based on real facts, where you have, for one thing, massive amounts of money spent to distort the debate, and second, the arbiters of facts being distorted, you have a grave risk, I think, for the future of our civilization. So I take this issue seriously, and I'm even more concerned to see over the next 4 years. I mean, you're optimistic, but you live here. I got to get back on a plane where, it's just getting started, and you have a commander-in-chief who has understood the most powerful techniques of propaganda, frankly, of fascist enterprise, to try to force the people to listen to what he has to say all the time. I live in what I think is a free society. I nonetheless see the great leader's picture every day like 10 times and his slogans. And the United States is in serious trouble, and I think it's those who value freedom, it's their time to fight.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Just for the record, because this point of view ought to be at least expressed, I'm sure if Tony Blair were here, he would say it wasn't fake news. He'd seen evidence and he came to that conclusion. He believed it.
I was actually blaming the American.
No, sure. But just so if anyone is afterwards going to challenge us on that.
Fake evidence.
Okay, so that's it. I'm just saying what he would say if he were here, which he's not. Like Facebook, he's not here tonight. Let's go to you, Jimmy Wales. I think the last thing that Tim said there cues you up nicely, because we didn't answer the question that came over there about what role Donald Trump has played in this. Are we in a way talking about fake news because of him? Would we have done it otherwise? And there was also, this is the only question left unanswered, the contribution from over there suggesting that family members, people close to people, not an algorithm, but not a machine, but other friends and family members could play a role in saying, you know what, don't post that, it's not real. But your closing thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, so on that point, Tim asked the question, Facebook deals with pornography, but the truth is, none of my friends are posting pornography. I don't know what kind of friends you've got, Tim, but that just doesn't happen, right? And so, and the other question, how could some pieces of the Wikipedia model be applied here? And for me, that's about genuine community control, and I don't have an easy answer for Facebook on that. But I do think one of the things that they could do algorithmically that would be purely opt-in, purely voluntary, it's very similar to your app idea, is if they, one morning I got up and I got on Facebook and they said, oh, new option, do you want this? Instead of just showing you things that we think you're going to like, we want to show you some things that we think you're going to disagree with, but appear to be quality. Because I would love to get out of my filter bubble, right? Living in London, I just thought, well, there's no way Brexit's going to pass, like everybody I know, and the media and everything else. No, I missed a lot. I missed what was going on, and I would love to get out of my filter bubble. And I do think that Facebook, for purely business reasons, not as a matter of regulatory being forced to do so, they need to improve the quality of my experience there. And if I feel like Facebook is misleading me because all my friends agree with me, and then therefore I'm not being challenged intellectually, that's a problem. I want to be challenged intellectually because that's what the future depends on.
Thank you. I think it's been a real tour d'horizon from our stellar panel. Tons to think about here, and I think pretty well all of it accurate and truthful. So I'm sure you're going to want to join me in thanking all of our guests and people here. Tim Wu, Armando Iannucci, Sarah Sands, James Nichols, Jimmy Wales, Craig Silverman. Thank you all. Thank you.